on sort of the mental health, mental well-being side, what has stood out to you about that issue that maybe we don't talk enough about publicly?
Yeah. I think there's two things that have stood out to me that feel like worth grappling with further. First is this idea of a script for men. And this is something that Richard Reeves has been talking about, since he's first started this work. It's this idea of, as a man, who am I? What do I owe to my community, to myself, to the economy? Very clearly men have had a changing role over the past few generations. I mean, what men owe to their families is different as women's role in the workforce has evolved. And, again, that's not a bad thing that this change has happened, but there is a sense that this loss of a script has had an impact on men, and we need to deal with that fact. I think the other thing that has stood out is the idea of isolation and community and connectedness for men. There does seem to be a lacking, maybe even a growing lacking, when it comes to men's ability to feel connected and to not exist in isolation. And so when it comes to thinking about eventually the solutions here, I think that that's probably where we're going to end up going. But I'm really curious to see, what does the data have to say about both of these things?
On the community aspect, it reminds me, as part of this survey research, the report that we're releasing now, we also conducted some focus group conversations with a handful of the respondents, just to find some anecdotal quotes and those kinds of things to accentuate data points. One of the comments in one of the focus group conversations was from a man who had been working fully remotely, and he made the comment that working fully remotely is great. I wouldn't trade it for the world. Like, I get all this extra time with my family, and that's a huge blessing. Then he said, but I'm also lonelier than I've ever been.
Yeah,
and I think it's because the report talks a lot about this theme of sort of missing anchors, right? The men who really struggle tend to not really be connected to a family, a faith community, their sort of civic infrastructure. If they are employed, they don't have a whole lot of satisfaction with their work situation.
Yeah.
But for the men who do have all those things, I think there's still sort of this dearth of community connection that if everything that I do is sort of my work and my family, and there's not other sort of, again, community or civic infrastructure beyond that, I think that can contribute to sort of the loneliness that you're talking about.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is another example of where, the trend of improved technology, the ability to work remotely, I mean, these are great things. We don't want to go backwards on that, in the same way that we don't want to go backwards on women's ability to participate in the workforce and be breadwinners for their family. These are great things, but it does demand that we change some other things to accommodate for the unintended consequences, I would call it, of these innovations. And so that's what we're facing.
And I think that, like, all of this stuff ties together. We tend to approach this issue, what we've been doing in these conversations with our task force and with this report, through the three buckets of health, vocation, and purpose. So mental and physical health. Vocation, we would say, work and education. And then purpose is kind of maybe the most nebulous, but I think in a lot of ways the most important. But they're all cross-cutting and related to one another. And I think some of the mental health data shows that. I want to share a couple of these stats from our report. So one, this goes to the argument or the notion, I guess, that, well, most men are still doing okay. So here's an example of that. Men nationwide report an average mental health score of 74.63. This is on a scale of 100, 100 being great, 0 being terrible.
And self-reported,
self-reported. So nationally, men say their mental health on average is about 75. Utah men report an average of about 77, 78. So pretty comparable, like solid, decent, okay, however you would interpret that. But then when the survey asks about other things like stigma around mental health or social supports for those kinds of things, nationwide, 30% of men say they don't have anyone they can really talk to about their mental health. And then only 15% of Utah men say the same. So nationally, almost a third of men say, there's not really anyone I can talk to if I am experiencing mental health challenges. 15% in Utah. So we do better than the national average here in Utah. But still, nationally, almost a third of men saying, if I'm struggling with something, I can't talk to anyone about it. I don't have anyone. And that seems really striking to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also striking is the difference between the national reported level and locally, because this idea of connectedness, which seems really critical to the issue, is something I think Utah actually does really well on, in large part because religiosity is so high in Utah, and the structure of participation in a church community can create connectedness and these opportunities. And so it's interesting to see how that plays out in terms of men's sense of whether or not they have someone to talk to.
There's some survey findings in the report that looks at that specifically, that sort of asks religiosity, connection to a faith community, connection to family, how that impacts their self-reported answers to questions like, I understand my purpose in life, or I'm needed in society, or essentially, I know what I'm supposed to do. And it is higher for folks who report religiosity, for folks who report family connection. And so I think that I would interpret that as something that in Utah, because we have such high rates of married two-parent households, of religious engagement, of, again, these various layers of civic infrastructure.
Right.
I think sometimes people might hear that stat and say, well, if somebody says they don't have anyone to talk to about their mental health, we just need more mental health counselors.
Right.
That could be helpful in some ways.
Sure.
I don't actually think that's what this is saying. I think it's what you're saying. It's the community connection, sort of the social capital.
Yeah.
We have more of that in Utah, which I think partly explains that difference. That's maybe where we need to focus as a society. How do we build that up?
Yeah, and I'll say it happens to be religious-driven communities that we have here in Utah, but I honestly think that the critical piece when it comes to this is the community, and you could have institutions of all types that create community. It happens to be that religion does a really great job as an institution of creating community, but I think that's what we're seeing.
I agree. Another stat or two that really kind of stood out to me, this is really interesting, Beth, so I'd love to hear your perception on this, especially when, as a national expert in a number of ways, and kind of looking at things from sort of the national perch, what this maybe tells you as far as this issue.
Okay.
So this is about kind of diving a little bit deeper into that question of, well, who can you talk to if you are struggling? Nationwide, 22% of men believe discussing mental health challenges with a professional is a sign of weakness. That perception actually increases to 29% when asked about discussing mental health challenges with someone in their immediate circle, like a spouse, partner, or close friend. So a little more than 1 in 5 say, I can't talk to a professional. That means that's weakness.
Yeah.
Closer to a third, 29%, saying if it's my wife, a close friend, someone in my circle, same kind of thing. So one, it's just the percentage to begin with, but the fact that there's a stigma that exists with talking to a mental health professional, but even a little bit more of a stigma when talking to someone in your immediate circle.
Right. That's so interesting. And how do Utah men compare on that?
So in Utah, it's 9% for both those categories. So in Utah, only 9% of men believe discussing mental health challenges with a professional or a spouse, partner, or friend is a sign of weakness. So that stigma is a lot lower in Utah than on the national level.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild. I mean, very, very clearly, like the sense of isolation that comes from not being able to speak to somebody about the things that you're grappling with internally, emotionally, is very serious. And the question that raises for me is, where do you go on that front? Because it's, I love these clean policy levers like tax credits and subsidies, and none of those speak to this particular challenge. So I know we'll get there in the conversation, but it just sort of begs the question for me is, what's the solution here?
I think that's spot on. We need to take a quick break here in a second, but when we come back, I want to dive in a little bit more on that topic because, to your point, we so often address any public policy issue or any societal issue as, to your point, well, what can the government do? What's the public policy intervention? And I think there are some on this topic for sure that we should be talking about. But I also think leaders, civic leaders, religious leaders, business leaders, and elected officials, governors and state legislators, and even folks at the federal level, yes, it's appropriate to think, well, let's stay in our lane when we're talking about government policy. But I think sometimes we undersell the power of the bully pulpit term that I think obviously is used typically to apply to the president or the governor or those kinds of things. But I think legislators have that too, that if more elected officials were talking more about, like, yes, what we do over here in government public policy is important and we can do some things that are helpful. We also need more of that social civic infrastructure. Yeah. And it kind of gets back to, I think you mentioned at the beginning, this idea of maybe self-responsibility as a society, that we as people if we care about this issue, and anyone watching or listening to this, if you care about this and think, man, we need to help improve these things, don't look to the government immediately first.
Yeah.
Think, well, what can I do in my community, in my family, in my faith community, in my neighborhood? How do we leverage that civic infrastructure for social capital? I think that's something we can still talk about a lot more.
I think leadership matters, and I think this is an issue where leadership is going to matter really deeply in getting us out of the trajectory that we're on.
Thanks for watching that clip of Defending Ideas. For the full conversation, click the link in the description, and make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your shows.